back, Doll fans. I needed to take a second before I made this video about pretty much what's going to happen next with the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, the whole Chris Greer thing came out, and I just didn't want to make a video right off the bat. I just needed to take a second to process everything, and really contain all my thoughts and all that. Of course, we don't wish anybody getting fired, but I just don't think that he was the right guy for the job. I think everybody kind of thought that. So here's the thing. The next move, we all are happy that Chris Greer is gone. That's great, but we also forget that we're the Miami Dolphins. So the next move is the most important one, because if you don't choose the right next guy, none of this matters. All that really happens is that we continue doing the same thing over and over again. So the next person, I already have some names. I think my front runner for the general manager would be like a Bruce Arians. But you need to, here's what I think. Here's my philosophy. Zach Thomas, Dan Marino, even though they're not like a part of the team in decision making and all that stuff, they are still a part of the team. So my personal opinion, this next roundabout, because it's been a long time since we've had any relevancy, you go to Dan Marino and you go to Zach Thomas. Obviously you offer them the job, but as far as I see it, I just don't know if they want it. But what you say is, after you offer it, even if they don't want it, that they sit in with you for all of the interviews, and this general manager that we then hire next, they're the ones that decide who they think is best. You take Dan Marino, Jason Taylor is coaching the University of Miami doesn't do anything, so you take all of them. You take all the Hall of Fame players that you have, even Larry Zonka. I mean, I know he's older, but at this point, you need anything. You take all of these players and you bring them to the interview process with you as Stephen Ross, and you allow them to really kind of decide who's going to be the next general manager. Like I said, I've thrown out Bruce Arians. Obviously, Louis Riddick is another one. But we need to choose right. I think when we look at the NFL right now, people are turning franchises around within an instant. It's becoming almost regular that a team that would mediocrely go like 2-5 or 6 and whatever every single year, they get the right people and they turn it right around. The Redskins, the Detroit Lions, it seems to be a thing. So what Stephen Ross needs to focus on next is making sure that they get the right people for this job, because you can turn your franchise around in an instant. And when you look at this roster, I know we're probably going to trade Jalen Phillips, we're probably going to trade Bradley Chubb, but when you look at this roster, there are some pieces to build upon. Jalen Waddle is a great wide receiver. Devon Achane is another great running back. Ollie Gordon is a piece to build on. Patrick Paul is also phenomenal. We'll see who else stays. But you have kind of a building block. Obviously, the way that this year is going, the one thing that I think people aren't relying upon is that if Mike McDaniel is staying, they're trading away players, but, and there's a big but here, if they're not going to fire the coaching staff, they're going to want to win, because they want to show out for whatever next job they're going to get. Anthony Weaver, Mike McDaniel, they're going to want to show out. And one of the bigger issues that I have right now is we're going to get offensive linemen back. We're going to get James Daniels. We're going to get Austin Jackson. So does the offense play well enough so that after the Buffalo Bills and all of that, we start winning some games and kind of dropping our draft pick? That's the one thing that I'm worried about. But again, with this coming season of pretty much retooling everything, I really wouldn't think that Mike McDaniel's going to be back next season. You need to choose the right person. We don't need to get happy right now about, the firing of Chris Greer, because we've been through this. We've been through firings and hirings and firings and hirings and firings and hirings, and it's just the same thing. We end up 8-8, 9-8 now, every single season. So the next person, the whole entire Hall of Fame staff, all of the Dolphins need to be into this next general manager, because this is going to be the guy that either continues this or completely changes this whole entire team, this whole entire philosophy, culture, all of it, if you pick right. We have a couple of head coaches coming out as well. There's obviously the Gruden. There's obviously, we talk about Chris Shula. It has the lineage. There's going to be a couple of head coaches. But I think it's more so about the general manager, because the head coach as well, obviously, but the general manager is the guy that hires the head coach, that sees football operations and sees the cap space and how to manage the team properly. And what I mean by that is, obviously, this last tenure, the reason that we have failed is because we spent all of our money on a couple of players and weren't able to build really around them at all. A lot of people talk about Tua's contract, but the unfortunate part was not that they paid Tua, but that they, got Tyreek Hill, Jalen Ramsey, Bradley Chubb. They got all of these players. So, typically with those types of teams, when you have a franchise quarterback that you pay a lot of money to, you tend to utilize a lot of that money to protecting that quarterback. And then you build, the rest of it out through draft picks. But, like you see with Patrick Mahomes, the reason why the Chiefs are so good this year is because, they paid Patrick Mahomes. They had to take a couple of cap savings, throughout the years. They ended up drafting well. They paid, the guard that they needed to pay. But for the most part, they weren't just throwing out contracts every single place. They just drafted well, and whoever was a manageable contract, that's the one that they gave to. But what the Dolphins ended up doing is giving pretty much max contracts to a couple of players, and it screwed them, because Tua is not a Josh Allen. So you couldn't pay the money to protect Tua, and what ended up happening is that you see that Tua isn't a game changer. He's a point guard. He can manage the football game, but he isn't like a Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson that can just change the game by himself. He's not that. And that ended up being the problem. That's why a lot of people have Tua hate, but they don't realize that it's because you're trying to make him into something that he's not. And I get it that, the contract is the same as some of these other players, but it's a different person. And this is where we get into, people say that the team was built around him. No, it was built around Mike McDaniel. And Tua was also a piece in what Mike McDaniel wanted to do. He wanted to design a team that was super fast and gets the ball out quick. So it wasn't built around Tua. It was built around the scheme that Mike McDaniel wanted to run. But the unfortunate part of it is that you paid all the other players and you didn't pay the line. You didn't pay for the protection in order to run this type of offense, because you thought it was just going to be better. So, again, like I said, because it doesn't matter what quarterback we draft. It doesn't matter, the players that we end up getting. If the culture isn't changed, nothing matters. The next step is the most key, and they cannot do what they've been doing continually since I've been watching the Dolphins since I was like 13 years old. They can't continue doing this. They have to get the right general manager, because this is like pretty much a lifetime thing. Once you get the right GM, he's pretty much there for pretty much his whole career. You choose right, you're not choosing again till a new ownership comes into the team. So the next thing, Dan Marino, Jason Taylor, Zach Thomas, Larry Sonka, they all have to approve of this next guy so that we can move forward. I think that would be the best possible solution. If it's not one of them, in my personal dream, like crazy dream, is if Dan Marino just took over the general manager spot, or the VP, or whatever it is, or Zach Thomas, or someone along those lines. But I don't know if they want to take that. I don't know if they want to spend, their later years having to work just as hard as they did in their prime. That's kind of one of the things. They're kind of in retirement. Like, I hope Dan Marino would want it, but I just don't think he wants to. But they need to be a part of the decision making when it comes to this team, so we can turn this culture around. And Didn't matter what head coach you brought in or general manager. Stephen Ross himself is just not a good judge of football intellect. He's a good judge of, well, I think he's too much trying to be friends with people and too much trying to like people, and not so much as a businessman trying to get the right people. I think that's been the difference. That's why I say this next move, it doesn't matter if we keep choosing the same type of stupidity. We have to choose the right person. It has to be the most important decision of the entire Miami Dolphins franchise, because you're seeing teams change it, like teams completely turn it around like that. We can be the same if we choose this next step right. I hope we do. Comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. Give me some ideas. I like Bruce Arians, Louis Riddick, but, there's a couple other people out there. It's tough to see a couple of them. I think the Rams guy as well, and the Philly assistant, would be another one. But let me know down in the comments below. Fins up, baby. Praise God, love guys. Great all the time. Love you all. Peace.